I don't know exactly how many of you were following along in the English or just listening to my mom's recitation, but something about that haftarah specifically kind of gets to me because it's almost if you're following along with the text, it's almost like we're reading like the minutes of a board meeting put to Trump, right? It's like, well, how do we keep the place in good condition? How do we collect dues? What do we do with the money? How is it accountable? It really is almost kind of like like a board meeting or bylaws being read out loud, but put to the beautiful tune of Haftarah and elevated to the status. It just strikes me as you know what was practical for them back then and what is now kind of ancient history for us in a really interesting way. Um, and it does tie into to what we are to what the theme of this parshat of the Shabbat Shkalim is, which is what I want to discuss a little bit more this morning. And so the obvious question to start with, which some of you may be wondering, is what exactly is this Shabbat Shkalim that Alex has been mentioning so many times and has not given really any context or explanation for? So that's what I'm going to try to do now. The most literal explanation I can give is that it is the Shabbat of the shekels. In case the word shkalim doesn't mean enough to you, the Shabbat of the shekels. It's not maybe the most super helpful definition, but at least it's a starting point. Shabbat shkalim is commemorated in the Shabbat before the month of Adar begins, or in a year like this one, when Rosh Chodesh falls on Shabbat, actually on Rosh Chodesh Adar. And like many facets of traditional Jewish practice, it actually has its origins in pretty mundane governmental details. What Shabbat Shkalim is essentially the Census Bureau conducting a capital campaign all at once. Remember, as we read a few weeks ago, back in the Torah post-Exodus times, the month of Nisan was actually established as the new year. And so as the new year approaches, and with it Passover, part of the administrative state's duties was to take a full annual census of the people, or at least a full annual census of the adult male people. And the way they did that over the course of the month of Adar was that each adult male would contribute 1/2 shekel, machatzit ha-shekel, and that money would then be dedicated to the upkeep of first the Mishkan, which is the next kind of big portion of Exodus that we'll read about, is the construction of the tabernacle. And later, as we just read in the Haftarah, the time of Kings, would be dedicated to the upkeep of the temple. And in a lot of ways, the continued observance, or even honoring our ties to Shabbat Shkalim, kind of leads me to ask many of the same questions that so many of the mitzvot and the laws that we talked about in this morning's parsha lead me to ask. What exactly is it doing here, and what is the law's continued relevance to us? On the very practical level, it's a good nudge that Purim is very soon and Pesach is right on its heels. But it's not entirely clear to me, at least on the surface, beyond that, why we bother preserving this association of temple service and census taking. And it's worth mentioning that if we really wanted to kind of make this living Jewish practice, maybe right now, instead of me talking, Sue or Barry would be up here giving the big annual appeal. Or we would think about starting our synagogue's fiscal year at the beginning of the month of Nisan, right before Pesach, instead of doing it around the high holidays. So I think we need to kind of put out that the significance of this lies elsewhere, and not just soliciting the now traditional $1.50 that the modern machatzit shekel mitzvah that we do around Purim time is observed. And so what I find the most striking about this observance of the Shekalim practice is from that last additional Torah reading we did this morning, Exodus chapter 30, verse 15. And in describing, this verse describes how the collection of the shekels was actually carried out. Ha'ashir lo yarbeh v'hadal lo yamit mimachatzit hashekel. The rich shall not give more, and the poor shall not give less than the half shekel. What we have in that verse is actually a pretty radical emphasis on equality within the community. Parshat Mishpatim, which we read this morning, in many ways emphasizes inequality and acknowledges how endemic inequality is in our societies. The Torah prepares us for the tensions that come about when we have poor within our communities, when we wind up oppressing others, for how important it is to care for the poor, the orphan, the widow, and the stranger. Yet with this practice of the half shekel, as it's laid out just a few chapters later, we're reminded that every individual in our communities counts in full, and that every individual counts the same. Rabbi Yerucham Leibovitz, an early 20th century spiritual and ethical leader in a Belarusian yeshiva, sums up the effect this mitzvah has. He explains that the practice of the machatzit shekel is actually much more challenging for the rich people in this ancient society. That even though a poor man might have to sell everything he owns to scratch up that half shekel, the rich man needs to humble himself and recognize that every person in society is in fact his equal. And in that respect, despite some of the cringeworthiness in this morning's Parsha, the Torah offers some hope and consolation. The Torah recognizes, often in fact, that our world is not a utopia. How else could a nation recently freed from their own slavery even think about owning their own slaves? Or the verse that I'm always kind of haunted by much later in the Torah, in Deuteronomy chapter 15, Ki lo yachdal evyon mikerev haaretz, for there will never cease to be needy ones in your land. But I challenge us to use the Torah's structure and laws to focus on restoration. I think one of the hallmarks of the law systems that are put in place throughout the text push back really heavily on systemic inequality and injustice. What else is the idea of the Jubilee year, if not a chance to reset and to level the playing field? And the constant admonitions to remember and care for all those who are the most often forgotten strives to make hardship a temporary and an individual condition, not an intergenerational one. And once a year, on Shabbat Shekalim, we gather every single person together and declare that each and every one of them is equal. And we strive our best to make that a reality.